Greetings, wanderers of the twilight paths. I am your lore-keeper this night, guardian of the forbidden chronicles that sleep in shadow's embrace. Tonight, I shall unveil to you a secret war that raged beneath the very roots of Middle-earth, a tale of fire and defiance that the histories dare not speak. Let the world above fade into memory as we descend together into the deep places of the world, where ember met eye in eternal contest. Close your eyes now and let my words carry you down into the darkness where truth burns brightest, and where sleep shall find you wrapped in the warmth of ancient flame. After the world-breaking thunder had stilled, and the last echoes of the War of Wrath faded into memory's depths, there came a silence so profound that even the stones seemed to hold their breath. Thangarodrim, that triple-crowned fortress of malice, lay shattered across the northern wastes like the broken bones of titans. Smoke rose in lazy spirals from 1,000 crevices, carrying with it the acrid scent of molten metal and the bitter ash of dreams undone. The very air hung heavy with defeat, pregnant with the weight of an age's ending. Yet in that desolation, two spirits stirred, each unbowed, each unbroken, though their master had been cast beyond the circles of the world into the void's embrace. The first was Gortor, the cruel, he who had been Mehron of the Forge Fires before corruption claimed him. Stripped of his beauteous form, yet mighty still in will, Sauron gathered the scattered fragments of his being from the wreckage of Angband. His essence coiled through the smoking ruins like a serpent of living shadow, tasting the bitter copper of failure upon the wind. Yet already his mind turned toward new dominions, new thrones, to claim in the world's wide spaces. But there was another who stirred in that hour of endings, one whose name the chroniclers have forgotten, whose deeds they deemed too terrible to record. Deep beneath the rubble and the ruin, where the very bedrock had cracked and wept tears of magma, a Balrog descended into the earth's secret arteries. This was no mere flight from justice, no cowering retreat of a defeated servant. Nay, this was the calculated withdrawal of a king who sought not exile, but a kingdom written in fire and stone. The Valoroko moved through passages that had never known the touch of daylight, down through caverns vast and measureless to mortal ken, its great wings, torn by the fury of divine wrath, folded tight against its massive frame as it navigated the narrow ways. The fire of its being, once a roaring conflagration that could melt steel and stone alike, now banked itself to a sullen glow-knot, dimmed by defeat but tempered by purpose. For Morgoth, in his malice and his cunning, had not left his servants empty-handed in defeat. Throughout the long war, in moments stolen between battles, the Dark Lord had seeded the world's foundations with fragments of his essence, cinders of will and warmth that pulsed like hidden hearts in the deep places. These were not mere trinkets or tokens of power, but living extensions of the Black Foe's hatred, waiting to be claimed by those with the strength and knowledge to seek them out. The Balrog sensed them now, those buried embers scattered like stars through the mountain's roots. They called to its kindred fire with voices sweeter than any song of the music, promising dominion over realms where no light of Valinor had ever shone. And so the great demon descended ever deeper, following veins of warmth through the world's hidden anatomy, until at last it came to the place that would become both its throne and its prison, the lightless halls beneath the peaks that mortal tongues would one day name Barazenbar, the Redhorn. Above, in the world of wind and weather, Sauron was already spinning new webs of power, seeking servants among the scattered children of darkness. But below, in the absolute black of the deep ways, another will was stirring in ancient, proud, and utterly uninterested in serving any master save the one who had been cast beyond the world's edge. The question rose like smoke from the ruins of the north. Who would claim Morgoth's hidden gifts, first the eye that would be, or the flame that already was? The contest for the world's foundations had begun, through passages that dwarf picks had never carved, and mortal feet had never trodden. The Balrog descended into the very bones of the earth. Leagues upon leagues it traveled, following the mountain's secret bloodstream, until at last it came to the place that would become its domain, the vast hollows beneath Barazanbar, and the halls that the children of Allah would one day call Khazad-dûm. Here, in caverns so immense that even the Balrog's flame seemed but a candle's flicker against their walls, the great demon found itself among company both ancient and strange. The nameless things that Gandalf would one day speak of in hushed tones were already there, gnawing at the world's foundations with patient malice. Creatures of slime and tentacle, of grinding tooth and acidic hunger. They had dwelt in the dark places since the world's making, growing fat on stone and time itself. The Balrog studied these beings with eyes like coals in the darkness, and in its immortal cunning, it saw opportunity where others might have seen only horror. These were not creatures to be destroyed, but assets to be employed, living tools that could serve its purposes in the wars to come. With words of fire and gestures of command, it bound them to its will through pacts written in sulfur and sealed with promises of feeding. The nameless things would gnaw where it directed, would retreat when it commanded, would serve as both sword and shield in the deep places. But the Balrog's true mastery was yet to be revealed. With power drawn from the earth's molten heart, it began to reshape the caverns to its design. Walls of living rock flowed like water under its touch, creating chambers and galleries according to some vast architectural vision. The very stone sang under its hands, taking on forms, both beautiful and terrible pillars that twisted like frozen flames. Arches that seemed to breathe in the darkness halls, whose acoustics could carry a whisper for miles or muffle the roar of avalanches. It was in this time of making that the Balrog first encountered the substance that would shape its destiny, veins of silver metal that gleamed with their own inner light, even in the absolute darkness of the deep. Mithril, the dwarves would call it in ages yet to come, but the Balrog knew it by older names, names spoken in the music's first themes. This was no mere precious metal, but star memory made manifest silver that remembered the light of Varda's lamps, and Telperian's radiance, and in that memory found the strength to resist all corruption. The Balrog tested its fire against the mithril veins, and found something remarkable. The metal did not melt, did not bend, did not yield to flame or force. Instead, it sang back with harmonies that made even the demon pause in wonder. Here was a substance that could shield as well as any ward, that could hide what lay within from prying eyes and grasping wills. The implications set the Balrog's ancient mind racing with possibilities. Working with patient skill, the demon began to weave the mithril through its domain like silver threads through a tapestry of stone. The metal became both foundation and fortification, creating a network of barriers that would confound any who sought to penetrate the deep realm's secrets. More than mere physical protection, The Mithril created what the Balrog came to think of as a star-silver hush, a zone of blessed silence where the commands of tyrants could not fully reach, where the will remained inviolate against all attempts at domination. Above, though the Balrog knew it not yet, the first children of Ola were beginning their great excavation. The sound of their hammers rang through stone like distant thunder, accompanied by voices raised in songs of crafting and creation. They delved with purpose and skill, following veins of precious metal ever deeper into the mountain's heart. Sometimes, in the deepest shafts, they would pause and listen to a sound they could not quite identify, a deep pulse in the rock, like the heartbeat of the mountain itself. The silver singing of Mithril guided their picks, leading them ever closer to the halls the Balrog had claimed, though neither side yet knew of the other's presence. It was a delicate dance of proximity and separation, of shared space and hidden purposes. The dwarves heard only the mountain's own music in their excavations, never suspecting that far below, an intelligence vast and ancient was watching their approach with eyes like dying stars. And in the deepest vault of all, where mithril veins converged like the spokes of some impossible wheel, the Balrog began to sense them. The cinders Morgoth had scattered through the world's foundations. They pulsed with familiar warmth, calling to the demon's own fire with voices that spoke of power and dominion beyond imagining. Soon, very soon, it would be time to claim them. But first, the realm must be prepared, the defenses made complete. For already, in the ruins of the north, another will was stirring, one that would not long remain content with defeat, one that would soon cast its gaze toward the deep places and demand submission from all who dwelt in darkness. In the smoking wasteland, where Thangarodrim once pierced the sky, Sauron walked among the ruins of his former glory and found them bitter as wormwood upon his tongue. The great forges lay cold and shattered, their fires extinct, their anvils cracked by the wrath of the Valar. Orkholds that had teemed with life now gaped like empty icicats in the blasted stone. The very air tasted of endings, of plans undone and kingdoms fallen into dust. Yet even in defeat, the deceiver's mind worked with the cold precision of a master craftsman examining flawed metal. This was not truly an ending, but merely an interval, a pause between movements in a symphony of dominion that had been playing since the music as first discordant notes. Already his thoughts turned southward, toward lands that lay beyond the reach of Valinor's immediate wrath, toward places where a new throne might be carved from the world's stubborn stone. Mordor called to him across the leagues, that land of shadow and fire, where the roots of the earth lay close to the surface, where the very stone sweated malice and the air shimmered with heat mirages born of natural furnaces. There he could build again, forge again, gather the scattered threads of darkness into a new and more terrible weaving. The vision seized him with such clarity that he could already see the towers rising, already hear the ring of hammers on anvils yet to be built. But first, there were other matters to attend, to old debts to collect, old allegiances to test. Sauron raised his voice then, not in speech, but in the deeper language of command that all creatures of shadow understood. The summons rolled out from him like ripples in a dark pool, spreading through earth and air and the secret spaces between stars. It was a threefold call, each note pitched to reach different ears, each harmony designed to bind different hearts. To the race of men scattered and fearful in the war's aftermath, he offered what they had always craved: strength to master their weakness, courage to seize what they desired, dominion over the beasts. and the bitter earth that sought always to humble them. His words found the proud and the ambitious, the cruel and the desperate, promising them kingdoms if they would but kneel and call him master. To the orc tribes hiding in mountain caves and forest depths, he sang a song of gathering, of claws sharp for rending, and tusks bright for battle. They knew his voice of old and answered with howls of recognition, streaming forth from their hiding places like ants from a disturbed hill. They had no choice in their answering bred for obedience, shaped for war. They were instruments that responded to his will as naturally as a blade responds to the swordsman's hand. But the third call was different, older, more complex, weighted with the authority of ancient pacts and binding oaths. This summons went out to the Valorokar, the demons of fire and shadow who had followed Morgoth into exile and war. These were not servants, but peers, fallen mire, whose power rivaled his own, whose allegiance had been won rather than compelled. To them he offered not commands, but partnership, reminding them of oaths sworn in the deeps of time, of shared hatred for the light that had cast them down. The summons traveled through paths unseen, racing along currents of malice that webbed the world like a second nervous system. It found the scattered spirits where they hid some in volcanic peaks, others in abyssal trenches, a few in the deep places beneath ancient mountains. Most heard and began the long journey toward Mordor, drawn by memory of brotherhood and the promise of renewed war against their enemies. But in the halls beneath Barazenbar, the summons met something unexpected: silence. The Balrog heard the call as clear as any bell, felt it tug at bonds forged in the earliest days of rebellion. Sauron's voice carried the weight of shared corruption, the familiar harmony of evil purpose that had once united them in Morgoth's service. It spoke of new battles to be fought, new realms to conquer, new opportunities to spread shadow across the face of creation. Yet in that silver-veined chamber, where Mithril sang with starlight's memory, the demon found its answer changed in the speaking. The metal's resonance altered Sauron's summons, revealing something that had been hidden beneath the honeyed words: the assumption of lordship, the expectation of obedience. This was not a call between equals, but a master's demand upon a servant. The Balrog's response came not in words, but in the deeper language of flame and furia, rejection. So absolute, it sent tremors through the mountain-s roots. It had sworn itself to Melkor, and to Melkor alone, in oaths that predated Sauron's corruption by ages uncounted. The unquenched oath, they called it, in the secret places, a binding that could not be transferred, could not be inherited, could not be claimed by any save the one who had first received it. And Morgoth was gone beyond recall, cast into the void where even his most faithful servants could not follow. Until the world's ending brought him back, the Balrog owed fealty to none, not to Sauron, not to any power that might arise, but only to its own ancient fire and the realm it was carving from the mountain's heart. The silence that answered Sauron's summons was more eloquent than any words, carrying implications that made the would-be Dark Lord's essence writhe with frustrated rage. If the Balrog would not come willingly, if it dared to deny his rightful authority, then perhaps other methods would be required. The deep places held secrets that even Sauron coveted, and patience had never been his virtue when defiance kindled before his gaze. In the ruins of Thangorodrim, plans within plans began to take shape, each more subtle and more terrible than the last. The foundations of the world trembled with the footfalls of gathering armies, as Sauron will spread like a plague across the eastern lands. In hidden valleys and forgotten caves, The servants of darkness stirred at his call, abandoning their refuges to seek the shadow that was growing in Mordor. Yet even as hosts marched and banners unfurled in the upper world, a different kind of war was beginning. In the spaces between spaces, in the goblin roads and the deep ways in passages carved by neither dwarf nor elf, but by creatures that had crawled from the world's first wounds, Sauron's servants among the orc tribes were not merely warriors, but infiltrators, skilled in the arts of passage and penetration that their master had taught them in Angban's smithies, through mountain passes too narrow for armies and tunnels too dark for honest folk. They began to spin a web of shadow beneath the Heitigler. Goblin chieftains who had thought themselves free to raid and pillage as they pleased suddenly found dark messengers at their council fires, bearing tokens of black iron and speaking of allegiance owed to a greater darkness. The tokens were not mere ornaments, but conduits, fragments of Sauron's will made manifest in metal that had been forged in the fires of his hatred. Each chief who accepted such a gift found his thoughts subtly altered, his ambitions aligned with purposes not entirely his own. Through this network of enslaved minds, the would-be Dark Lord began to map the deep places, seeking pathways that might lead him to the realm the Balrog had claimed. Black runes appeared on thresholds where no writing had been before, carved in languages that hurt the eye to look upon and the mind to comprehend. These were not mere territorial markings, but sorcerous anchors, points where Sauron's influence could take root and spread like a canker through the living rock. Wraith-faint captains, shadows given just enough substance to interact with the physical world, glided through the deepest passages on missions of reconnaissance and sabotage. But the Red King IV, so the goblin tribes had begun to call the Balrog in their fearful whispers, was not idle while this web took shape around its domain. The demon's mastery over stone and fire served it well in the art of subterranean warfare. Galleries that had taken orc clans generations to excavate collapsed without warning, sealing away entire communities in tombs of their own making. The collapses seemed like accidents, the unfortunate result of hasty excavation and poor engineering. But those with eyes to see might have noticed that they always occurred at precisely the moments when Sauron's influence was growing strongest. The nameless things, bound to the Balrog's service by pacts of mutual benefit, proved to be invaluable allies in this shadow war. They were creatures of hunger made manifest, beings that could dissolve stone with their acidic secretions and navigate passages too small for any other form of life. When orc bands carrying the Eyes tokens ventured to deep into the mountain's heart, they would find their path blocked by falls of seemingly natural rubble. But those who examined the debris closely might have noticed the peculiar smoothness of certain stones, the way they seemed almost digested rather than broken. Fear began to walk the deep roads in those days, not the simple terror of cave-ins and creature attacks, but something more subtle and more terrible. Goblins spoke in hushed voices of a Red King who ruled in the deepest places, who demanded tribute of those who would pass through his domain, and who punished those who bore the tokens of foreign masters. Raiding parties that had ventured forth with Sauron's black iron returned, changed. Their leaders, speaking of nightmares, made manifest and fires that burned without fuel in the absolute darkness of the deep. The season of fire had come to fair Iridian, and with it the thunder of armies that shook the very foundations of the earth. Sauron's hosts poured forth from Mordor like a black tide, their banners snapping in the wind that carried the smoke of burning cities. Gil-galad's warriors fought with the desperate courage of those who knew that more than kingdoms hung in the balance, that the very fate of light itself trembled on the edge of the sword. In the chaos of battle and siege, few marked the moment when Sauron himself strode toward the great gates that sealed Khazad-dûm from the outer world. The Dark Lord came not with armies, but alone, his presence a weight that made the very stones cry out in anguish. Before the doors of Durin he stood, those mighty portals of Mithril and stone that had guarded the dwarf realm for countless years, and raised his hand in summons and command. The gesture was simple, almost casual, but behind it lay power that could crack mountains and drain seas. Sauron spoke no words, for his will needed no voice to make itself known. The command that flowed from him was older than speech, deeper than thought, the raw assertion of dominance that had been his gift since the days when he stood at Alla Esforge as Mehron, the Admirable. But the doors did not open. The mithril tracery that decorated their surface blazed with sudden radiance, starlight made manifest in silver metal that remembered its origin in the lamps of Varda. The stones themselves seemed to sing in harmony, creating a wall of sound and light that turned the Dark Lord-S will back upon itself like water from a mountain-S face. For a moment that stretched like eternity, Sauron pressed his power against the barriers that defied him, pouring his malice into every crack and crevice, seeking the flaw that would grant him entrance. But Celebrimber's craft had been too subtle, the Balrog's wards too well woven. The gates held firm, and from the deep places came a sound like distant laughter mockery, edged with flame and sharpened on the whetstone of ancient pride. It was then that the true battle began, though no chronicler would ever record its details. Upon the knife-edge peak of Caradhras, where the wind howled through passes carved by glaciers and time, two wills met in contest that made the mountain itself a battlefield. Sauron sewed binding runes into the bedrock with gestures of command, each sigil a trap designed to snare the fire roads that pulsed through the mountain's heart. Far below, the Balrog felt those invasive marks, like thorns driven into living flesh, and answered with counter-songs of pressure and flame that shattered stone and sent avalanches thundering down the mountain-s flanks. Each rune Sauron carved was met with a tremor that cracked it apart. Each binding was answered with a surge of molten rock that melted the Dark Lord-s anchors back into shapeless slag. The duel raged through stone and fire, will against will, power against power. Sauron's mastery of dominion met the Balrog-s command over the deep places in a contest that sent shockwaves racing through the roots of the world. Tunnels collapsed, redirecting underground rivers into new channels. Goblin holds that had existed for centuries were sealed away behind walls of cooling lava. The very geography of the underworld shifted as ancient passages were destroyed and new ones carved by forces beyond mortal comprehension. Caradhras itself became a weapon in that hidden war, its treacherous weather patterns the visible sign of invisible conflict. The storms that would one day threaten the Fellowship were born in those moments when two immortal wills grappled for control of the mountain-s substance. Snow that fell upward, winds that blew from all directions at once, cold that could freeze the blood in living Vainzel were manifestations of the battle that raged in realms beyond the reach of mortal sight. But even Sauron's power had its limits, and the Balrog fought on its own ground with advantages that could not be overcome by will alone. The mithril veins that webbed through the mountain created zones of stability that no force could breach, anchors of star memory that held firm against the storms of malice. The fire roads responded to the Balrog's call with loyalty earned through centuries of patient mastery, carrying its commands to the farthest reaches of the mountain range. In the end, it was frustration rather than defeat that drove Sauron back. His messengers were entombed in cooling stone, his runes cracked and useless, his careful plans disrupted by tremors that followed no pattern he could predict or counter. The eye that would be found its gaze turned back upon itself by mirrors of silver light, its commands muffled by songs of starlight that predated its corruption. With a snarl of rage that sent new avalanches cascading down Redhorn's slopes, Sauron turned away from the gates that would not yield and marched south to complete his conquest of a region. Behind him, the doors of Durin remained closed, their mithril tracery dimmed but unbroken. While in the deep places, the Red King counted the cost of victory and prepared for wars yet to come. The mountain settled into uneasy quiet as the two powers drew apart, but the scars of their conflict would remain forever. In ages yet unborn travelers would curse the malice of Caradhras and wonder at the source of its treachery, never suspecting that they walked above the battlefield, where will had met will in contest for the world's hidden heart. And from the west carried on winds that tasted of salt and distant shores, came the first rumors of a new power, rising ships with silver sails, bearing warriors whose might had not been tested since the world was young. Numenor was coming, and with it changes that would reshape the balance of all powers, both hidden and revealed. The sea winds carried tidings that made even the stones tremble with anticipation, for the ships of Numenor darkened the horizon like storm clouds pregnant with lightning. Eärfarasin the Golden had answered Gil-galad's call with such might that the very ocean groaned beneath the weight of his fleets. Banners of blue and silver snapped in the salt breeze, bearing the device of the tree and the stars. While in the harbor of Umbar, Sauron's own servants cowered at the sight of sails that blotted out the southern sky. The Dark Lord felt the net closing about him and made his choice with the cold calculation that had served him through ages of strife. He would not spend his strength in hopeless battle against odds that even his power could not overcome. Instead, he would play a deeper game, one that turned apparent defeat into the seeds of greater victory. When the men of the West came to make him prisoner, they found him waiting in his tower, clad in fair form and bearing gifts of submission. In the deep places beneath Barazenbar, the Balrog felt the tremor that passed through all the circles of the world when Sauron allowed himself to be taken in chains of gold and silver. It was a vibration felt not in stone or metal, but in the very fabric of malice itself, the moment when the web of shadow that had been spread across Middle-earth suddenly went slack, its central spider carried away to spin new webs in western halls. The Red King's response was swift and certain. If Sauron's direct influence was to be removed from the world, even temporarily, then this was the time to consolidate what could be held and to hide what could not be yielded. Through the fire roads that networked the mountain's depths, the Balrog sent forth what it came to call the silent laws edicts that would govern the deep places while greater powers played their games in the world above. The goblin tribes that had once served the Eye found themselves bound by new rules, written not in fear, but in necessity. They could breed and raid as their nature demanded, but they must bear no token of foreign masters, speak no word that might carry tales to distant ears. The passages that led deepest into the mountain's heart were sealed with wards that even the bravest orc would not dare to challenge, while those tunnels that remained open were patrolled by things that had no names and desired no light. But it was in the crafting of the Cinder Vault that the Balrog's true mastery revealed itself. In a chamber where the earth's hottest vein met Mithril's cold radiance, the demon wrought a work that would have impressed even the smith of Ola in the days before corruption. Part treasure house, part shrine, part crucible of hidden fire. The vault was designed to hold the greatest of Morgoth's scattered gifts, safe from all who might seek to claim or corrupt it. The chamber itself was a marvel of balance and precision, its every angle calculated to focus and contain forces that could reshape continents. Walls of living rock flowed like frozen music, their surfaces inlaid with veins of mithril that formed patterns too complex for mortal minds to fully grasp. The floor was a mosaic of volcanic glass and star metal, each piece fitted so perfectly that not even the thinnest blade could slip between them. At the chamber's heart lay the prize itself, a cinder of Morgoth. This was not mere ember or coal, but crystallized hatred given substance, the concentrated essence of the Dark Lord's will to unmake all that the music had created. In the wrong hands, it could serve as the seed of dominion that would make Sauron's power seem paltry by comparison. But the Balrog was not merely hoarding treasure like some dragon of the latter days. The vault was designed as much to protect the world from the cinder as to protect the cinder from the world. The balance of star silver and underfire that surrounded it created a field of neutralization, a zone where Morgoth's gift could rest without spreading its corruption to infect the living stone around it. The demon worked with patient skill through seasons that meant nothing in the timeless depths, crafting wards and barriers that would confound any who sought to penetrate the vault's secrets. Each layer of protection was different from the last. Some relied on physical barriers of unprecedented strength, others on illusions that would lead intruders astray, still others on traps that would seal unwary explorers in tombs of their own making. Above, the world settled into the strange peace that came when its greatest tyrant was carried away in golden chains. The dwarves of Khazad-dûm delved deeper than ever before, following veins of mithril that seemed to sing with renewed clarity now that the shadow no longer pressed down upon them. Their hammers rang with joy in the deep places, never suspecting how close their excavations brought them to chambers where older powers held sway. The Balrog watched their approach with eyes like dying stars, calculating distances and probabilities with the patience of geological ages. Each blow of their picks brought them closer to the boundaries of its domain. Each song of their crafting carried new harmonies that resonated through the mountain's bones. Soon, very soon, the children of Allah would breach the outer wards, and choices would have to be made about how much to reveal and how much to hide. In the west, Numenor's glory reached heights that made even the undying lands seem pale by comparison. Ar-Pharazôn's power grew with each passing year, fed by the counsel of his captive guest, who whispered of glories that could be won and dominions that could be claimed. The island kingdom bloomed like a flower opening to poisoned sunlight, beautiful and terrible, and doomed to a fall that would shake the foundations of the world. But in the deep places, time moved to a different rhythm, and patience was a virtue that could be practiced for ages beyond count. The Red King waited in its silver-shadowed halls, tending fires that had burned since the world's making, guarding secrets that predated kingdoms and would outlast the rise and fall of empires. Whatever storms might rage in the world above, the deep places would endure, and with them the choices that would shape ages yet unborn. The years of Namenor's glory passed like a fever dream, each season bringing new marvels that blazed like stars before burning themselves to ash. In halls of white stone and golden wood, Sauron walked in fair form among those who thought themselves his captors, whispering counsel that was honeyed poison poured drop by drop into eager ears. The island kingdom reached heights of power that made the very seas tremble, its towers piercing the sky like spears aimed at the heart of heaven itself. Yet all the while, in the deeps beneath distant Barasandbar, the Red King felt the tremors of that glory like distant thunder. Each new folly of the Númenóreans sending ripples through the web of malice that connected all dark powers. The Balrog had withdrawn so deeply into its domain that even the mountain-s roots seemed shallow by comparison, descending into chambers that had never known the touch of starlight or the breath of wind. Here, where the very stones sweated fire and the air itself burned with suppressed power, the demon felt the eye's influence more keenly than ever before. Though Sauron's body was trapped in Namenor's golden halls, his will ranged free across the waters, seeking always to penetrate the veils that hid the deep places from his sight. The One Ring, hidden away in Mount Doom's fires, pulsed with patient hunger, sending out tendrils of compulsion that sought to bind all powers to its master's service. 9 times the wraiths tried to pierce the mithril barriers that guarded Khazad-dûm's heart. 9 times they were turned back by harmonies that their corrupted essence could not bear. The Nazgul moved through shadow like knives through silk, but in the star-silver halls their substance grew thin and their purpose wavered. They could no more grasp the Balrog's domain than fire could grasp the wind. For their being was to bound to domination, to comprehend the fierce independence that blazed in the deep places. One of the 9, bolder or more desperate than his fellows, pressed deeper into the mountain's heart than any of his kind had dared. Through passages that echoed with the memory of dwarf songs and chambers that gleamed with veins of precious metal, he glided like a shadow given form. But when, at last, he came to the first of the true Berioza wall of living mithril that sang with the voice of ancient starlight, his courage failed him utterly. The wraith retreated, whimpering from that encounter, bearing tales of a ringing silence that was not sound, of light that burned without flame, of a presence that met his gaze with eyes like dying suns. His report to distant Mordor spoke of defenses that could not be breached by stealth or strength, of a will that acknowledged no master save the one who had been cast beyond the circles of the world. Yet for all the barriers that protected the Balrog's realm, the demon could not remain entirely isolated from the world's affairs. Orc tribes still came seeking passage through the deep roads, still offered tribute and obedience to the Red King who ruled beneath the mountains. But now they came on his terms, accepting the silent laws that governed those who would traffic in the deepest places. No token of the eye could pass beyond the outer halls, no rune or sigil that spoke of distant allegiance. Those who bore such marks were turned away at the threshold, their leaders given a choice between abandoning their foreign loyalties or seeking other roads for their purposes. Most chose submission to the silent laws, recognizing that the Balrog's protection was worth more than Sauron's distant promises. The deep places became a realm unto themselves in those years, governed by laws that predated the rings and kingdoms of the later ages. Trade flowed through the fire roads according to patterns that served the Red King's purposes, while tribute poured into hidden vaults from goblin holds that spanned the breadth of the misty mountains. It was a kingdom of shadow and flame, invisible to the eyes of the world above, but no less real for all its secrecy. In the west, Numenor's pride reached heights that made even the Valar take notice. Ar-Pharazôn's fleets darkened every sea. His armies marched beneath banners that bore challenges written in gold and silver. The king's captive counselor smiled and whispered, feeding ambitions that grew like cancer in the kingdom's golden heart, preparing the ground for a harvest that would surpass even Morgoth's wildest dreams of destruction. The Balrog felt the moment when those dreams finally bore their bitter fruit, instant when Numenor's king set foot upon the shores of Aemon, and the world broke apart like an egg cracked by an angry hand. The change that followed was not merely physical, but metaphysical, an alteration in the very nature of existence that sent shockwaves racing through every hidden corner of creation. Sauron's fair form perished in that cataclysm, his flesh consumed by fires that burned hotter than the forges of creation. But his essence endured, racing back across the sundered seas to take refuge in the only fortress that remained in Violith, the Tower of Barad-dur, where the One Ring waited to clothe his naked spirit in new and more terrible raiment. In the deep places, the Red King felt that homecoming like a weight settling upon the world's shoulders. The eye was opening again, its gaze ranging forth to catalogue what had been lost and what remained to be claimed. The time of hiding was ending, and soon the Shadow War would begin, a noob, this time with stakes higher than either power had dared to imagine when their conflict first began. The stage was set for the final movements of a symphony that had been playing since the music's first discordant note. And in the silver-shadowed halls beneath Barad-dur, ancient fires stirred with anticipation of battles yet to come. From the ashes of drowned Numenor, Sauron rose, like smoke given malevolent form, his essence racing eastward across the broken waters to take refuge in the only citadel that could contain his diminished but still terrible power. Barad-dur received its master's return with a shuddering that ran through every stone, every iron beam welcoming back the will that had shaped them from raw malice and ambition. There in chambers where no light of star or sun had ever shone, the Dark Lord began the slow work of clothing his naked spirit in new flesh of shadow and flame that would never again know the weakness of fair form. The eye opened for the second time in the world's long history, and its gaze fell upon realms that had changed beyond recognition in the years of his absence. Kingdoms had risen and fallen, alliances had shifted like sand in the wind, and powers that had once seemed immutable had proven as fragile as morning frost. Yet one constant remained in the deep places beneath Barad-dur. A rival flame still burned with undiminished pride. The Nine rode forth from Minas Morgul like hounds unleashed, their purpose now sharpened to a razor's edge by their master's renewed focus. No longer did they seek merely to scout and infiltrate now. They came as harbingers of ultimatum, carrying with them the weight of Sauron's absolute authority. The wraiths moved through shadow and starlight with equal ease, their passage marked by the withering of flowers and the flight of birds from darkened skies. Yet when the Nazgul came again to the borders of Khazad-dûm, they found the barriers stronger than ever. The mithril veins that webbed through the mountain's depths had grown in the years of peace, spreading their star-silver radiance through chambers that had once known only darkness. The very air itself seemed to thrum with harmonies that their corrupted essence could not endure, melodies that spoke of light from before the world's marring. One by one, the nine tested the boundaries of the Balrog's domain, seeking some crack or flaw that might grant them passage. But where once there had been narrow corridors guarded by flame and fury, now they found walls of living light that turned their substance thin as mist. The wraiths could no more force entry than shadows could grasp the noonday sun, for their being was antithetical to the star memory that protected the deep places. The boldest of them pressed against the barriers until his form began to fray, his essence scattered like smoke in a hurricane wind. He retreated at last with a cry that echoed through the mountain's roots-knot pain, for the Nazgul had long since forgotten such simple sensations, but the anguish of absolute frustration. His report to the Barada spoke of defenses that had grown stronger rather than weaker, of a will that remained as unbendable as the mountain itself. In the goblin holds that ringed the Balrog's domain, a new kind of commerce began to flourish. Orc clans that had once served multiple masters now found themselves caught between competing loyalties, their chieftains forced to choose between the distant promises of Mordor and the immediate protection of the Red King. Most chose pragmatically, recognizing that the Balrog's power was present and tangible, while Sauron's remained largely theoretical. The silent laws that governed trade in the deep places became more elaborate with each passing season, creating a complex web of obligation and reward that bound the goblin tribes ever more tightly to their hidden sovereign. Those who served faithfully found their territories expanded, their enemies crushed, their followers multiplied beyond counting. Those who bore tokens of foreign allegiance found their passages blocked, their movements monitored, their purposes frustrated at every turn. Yet, for all the Balrog's success in maintaining independence, the demon could not ignore the growing pressure of Sauron's attention. The eye's gaze fell upon the misty mountains with increasing frequency, searching for some weakness that might grant access to the treasures hidden in their depths. Each scrutiny was like the weight of a mountain pressing down upon the stone, seeking to crush through force what could not be penetrated by stealth. In response, the Red King began to weave new protections, not merely barriers of mithril and flame, but deeper wards that touched upon the very foundations of reality. The star-silver veins were encouraged to spread their influence through chambers that had never known their touch, creating networks of resistance that operated on levels beyond the merely physical. Each strand of protection was both anchor and weapon, holding the Balrog's domain secure while preparing for conflicts yet to come. The orc tribes spoke in hushed whispers of changes in their sovereign, how the Red King's presence had grown more terrible and more magnificent with each passing year, how its voice now carried harmonies that made the mountain itself tremble in response. They told tales of audiences granted in chambers where the very air burned with suppressed power, where words were spoken that could reshape the bedrock and redirect the courses of underground rivers. In the deepest vault of all, where Morgoth's greatest gift lay cradled in balances of fire and starlight, new protections took shape that would have challenged the understanding of even the Valar themselves. The Cinder Vault became more than mere treasure house. It evolved into a nexus where multiple realities touched and influenced one another. A place where the possible and the actual merged in patterns too complex for any single mind to fully grasp. Above in the halls of Khazad-dûm, the dwarves continued their endless delving, following veins of mithril that sang with increasing clarity as they descended toward the mountain's heart. Each blow of their picks brought them closer to the boundaries of the hidden realm. Each song of their crafting carried new harmonies that resonated through the stone. The convergence that had been prophesied in the deep places drew ever nearer, and with it choices that would reshape the fate of all who dwelt beneath the mountain's shadow. In the high halls of Khazad-dûm, where crystal lamps cast rainbows through veins of living mithril, Durin Six walked among his people with the measured pace of one who carries the weight of ages. The greatest of the dwarf-lords bore upon his finger one of the 7 rings, its fire kindling his craftsman's soul to heights of creative fury that astonished even the masters of old. Under his reign, the realm beneath the mountain had expanded beyond all previous boundaries, delving deeper than any had dared before. The excavations followed patterns that seemed almost inevitable, as if the mountain itself were guiding the miners toward some predetermined destination. Each new gallery revealed wonders that made the previous age seem crude by comparison. Chambers vast enough to house armies, pillars of stone that had been carved by water into forms of impossible beauty, veins of precious metal so pure they seemed to sing in harmony with the miner's tools. Yet it was not merely greed that drove the dwarves ever deeper into the mountain's heart. The 7 ring upon Durin's hand whispered of treasures that transcended mere gold, or silver secrets that lay hidden in the deepest places, knowledge that could reshape the very art of making itself. The ring's influence was subtle but inexorable, feeding the king's natural curiosity until it became an obsession that consumed his waking thoughts. Nain, son of Durin, often walked beside his father through the newest excavations, his own craftsman's eye measuring the quality of stone and metal that their miners brought to light. He felt the pull of the depths as strongly as any of his house, but there were moments when he paused at tunnel mouths and listened to sounds that seemed to come from beyond the reach of pick and hammer, distant rumblings that might have been machinery or might have been breathing echoes that carried harmonics no dwarf song had ever produced. The miners spoke in low voices of changes in the stone as they descended past levels that had been mapped for generations. The rock grew warmer the deeper they went, taking on colors and textures that spoke of forces at work beneath the earth's surface. Veins of mithril that had run straight for leagues suddenly curved and twisted, following patterns that defied both logic and the natural laws of geology. It was in the deepest shaft of all that the first signs of the vault appeared, not the chamber itself, for that lay still leagues below, but the influence it cast upon the surrounding stone. Miners, working by the light of their crystal lamps, reported walls that seemed to shimmer with their own inner radiance, rock faces that grew warm to the touch without any visible source of heat. Durin himself descended to examine these anomalies, accompanied by the greatest masters of his house and a guard of warriors whose loyalty had been tested in the goblin wars of earlier ages. They found themselves in passages that seemed to exist at the boundary between the natural and the crafted, where living stone had been shaped by forces that left no tool marks but achieved precision beyond the reach of any dwarfsmith. The mithril here was different from any they had encountered before, not merely metal, but something that seemed to bridge the gap between matter and music. When struck, it produced harmonies that resonated through the bone and blood. Awakening memories of lights that had shone before the sun and moon were kindled. The very air seemed to thrum with potential, as if reality itself were more malleable in these depths. Deep beneath their feet, the Balrog felt the approach of the miners, like footsteps on the roof of a house. Each blow of their tools sent vibrations through the stone that carried both opportunity and danger in equal measure. The demon had known this moment would come eventually. The children of Allah were too skilled, too persistent, to be denied forever. The question was not whether they would breach the vault's outer boundaries, but when and how that breach should be managed. The Red King had spent centuries preparing for this convergence, weaving protections that would safeguard the deepest secrets while allowing for limited contact. The vault itself remained inviolate, hidden behind barriers that even the dwarves' skill could not easily penetrate. But the approach chambers had been shaped to serve as both warning and test, designed to reveal the character of those who would venture so far from the light. In Mordor, the eye felt the tremors that ran through the roots of the world as mining tools met barriers that had been placed by powers older than kingdoms. Sauron's attention focused upon the misty mountains with renewed intensity, his gaze pressing down through leagues of stone in search of the sources of disturbance. Something was stirring in the deep places, something that carried implications for the great game that had been playing since the world's youth. The Dark Lord's concern was not merely academic. His own power had grown immeasurably since his return from Numenor's ruin, but it remained dependent upon the complex network of allegiances and dominions that he had spent centuries constructing. If another power were to claim the treasures hidden beneath Barad treasures, whose nature he could sense but not clearly define, the balance of forces in Middle-earth might shift in ways that would threaten all his carefully laid plans. Yet even as the eye's pressure intensified, the star-silver barriers held firm against his scrutiny. The mithril veins that protected the Balrog's domain had been strengthened by centuries of patient cultivation, their resistance to external influence growing with each passing age. What Sauron could detect was maddeningly incomplete, glimpses of vast power carefully contained, hints of purposes that remained frustratingly opaque. In the excavation sites beneath Khazad-dûm, strange accidents began to multiply. Tools would break at crucial moments, supports would shift without warning, and always there was the growing heat that made work increasingly difficult as the miners descended toward their goal. Durin's craftsmen were too skilled to be deterred by such obstacles, but they began to proceed with greater caution, taking time to reinforce their work and to study the anomalies that seemed to multiply with each new level. The breakthrough came without warning on a day when the mountain's pulse seemed stronger than usual. Nain's pick, swung with all the strength of his mighty arm, shattered the last barrier of natural stone and revealed beyond it something that made even the stoutest dwarf heart quail with awe and terror. In the light of their crystal lamps, the vault's outer chamber stretched away into distances that seemed to mock the very concept of measurement, its walls alive with patterns of fire and starlight that no mortal craft had ever achieved. The crystal lamps of the dwarves flickered like dying stars in the vastness that yawned before them, their light swallowed by distances that seemed to bend back upon themselves in ways that hurt the mind to contemplate. Nain stood at the threshold of the vault's outer chamber, his weathered hand gripping the haft of the pick that had broken through the final barrier, and felt the weight of ages pressing down upon his shoulders. Before them lay a realm that existed at the intersection of dream and reality, where the fundamental forces that shaped the world had been woven into patterns of terrible beauty. The walls rose into shadows that no light could penetrate, their surfaces alive with veins of mithril that pulsed like the arteries of some vast, sleeping heart. Where fire and starlight met in the chamber's depths, the very air seemed to burn with possibilities that transcended the merely physical. King Durin Vi descended into that impossible space with the measured tread of one who walks knowingly toward his destiny. The seven ring upon his finger blazed with sudden radiance, responding to harmonies that had been sleeping in the mountain's heart since the world's foundation. Each step carried him deeper into chambers where the laws of nature bent like heated metal under the hammer of will, where reality itself seemed more malleable than clay in a potter's hands. The Balrog watched their approach through senses that transcended mere sight, feeling their wonder and their growing fear like flavors upon the supernatural wind. These were the children of Allah, inheritors of the smith's own gift for shaping and making, and in their blood ran the same fire that had once burned bright in Valinor's halls. They had earned the right to witness what lay hidden in the mountain's heart, but they had also earned the consequences of their discovery. Rising from depths that seemed to plunge toward the world's molten core, the Red King revealed itself at last to mortal eyes. Its form was both terrible and magnificent, wings of shadow that could blot out stars, a crown of fire that burned without consuming, eyes like dying suns that held within them the memory of light from before corruption. When it spoke, its voice was the sound of avalanches given meaning, of volcanic thunder shaped into words that echoed through both stone and soul. The demon S-words were not threat, but recognition, acknowledgement of the courage it had taken to delve so deep. Respect for the skill that had brought them through barriers that had held against lesser wills for centuries uncounted. It spoke of the ancient kinship between flame and forge, of the bonds that linked all who served the art of making, regardless of the forms their service might take. But with recognition came ultimatum. The children of Durin had breached the outer defenses of a realm that predated their kingdom by ages beyond count. They had looked upon secrets that were not meant for mortal eyes, had walked in chambers where powers older than the sun held court in shadow and flame. Such knowledge carried a price that could not be paid in gold or mithril, but only in choices that would echo through the ages, yet unborn. Durin the Sixth felt the weight of that choice settle upon him like a mantle woven from the stuff of fate itself. He could turn back now, seal the passages his people had opened, and pretend that nothing had been found in the deep places save more stone and metal. His kingdom would continue as it had for generations, growing in wealth and power, but remaining forever ignorant of the greater forces that shaped the world's hidden architecture. Or he could press forward, accepting the Demon-S challenge, and claiming the right to treat with powers that stood outside the normal order of things. Such a choice would grant his people access to knowledge beyond their wildest dream secrets of making that could reshape the very foundations of their craft. Understanding of forces that could turn mithril into something more precious than starlight itself. But acceptance would also bring dangers that no sword could guard against, and no armor could turn aside. The Red King was bound by oaths older than the sun to powers that had been cast beyond the world's rim, and those who trafficked with such beings risked contamination by the very malice they sought to contain. The vault held treasures beyond imagining, but it also held the seeds of corruption that could poison a kingdom from within. In Mordor, the eye felt the moment of decision, like a tremor in the web of power that connected all things to its will. Something was happening in the deep places, some convergence of forces that carried implications beyond immediate sight. The pressure of Sauron's attention fell upon the misty mountains, like the weight of storm clouds, seeking to penetrate the barriers that still held his gaze at bay. But even as the Dark Lord's power pressed against the mountain's defenses, he felt those barriers beginning to shift in ways that spoke of choices being made in chambers far below. The Mithril veins that had protected the Balrog's domain for so long were starting to resonate with new harmonies, their star-silver radiance taking on overtones that carried both promise and threat. Deep in the vault's heart, where Morgoth's greatest gift lay cradled in balances too delicate for crude force to disturb, ancient mechanisms that had slumbered for ages beyond count began to stir with the first tremors of awakening. The choices made in the chamber above would ripple outward through stone and fire, setting in motion changes that would reshape the hidden landscape of power throughout Middle. Durin the Sixth raised his eyes to meet the Balrog's gaze and spoke the words that would seal his people's fate, words of acceptance and alliance that rang through the chamber like hammer blows on the anvil of destiny. The compact was sealed, not in documents, but in fire itself, written in flames that burned without consuming and sworn by oaths that could not be broken while stone endured. In the deepest halls, where fire and starlight danced in patterns older than memory, the compact between dwarf and demon took shape like metal cooling in the forge. The words spoken by Durin VA echoed through chambers that had known only silence since the world's youth, binding both parties to terms that transcended the merely political bisek. This was not an alliance of convenience, but a recognition of shared purpose, the understanding that some treasures were too precious to be claimed by conquest, too dangerous to be left unguarded. The Balrog's voice carried harmonics that resonated through the seven ring upon Durin's finger, awakening responses that the dwarven smiths had never suspected lay within their greatest treasures. The ring blazed with new fire as ancient circuits of power completed themselves for the first time since its forging, revealing purposes that Celebrimbor himself had only dimly understood when his hands shaped the gold in Eregious halls. Under the demon's tutelage, Durin learned to hear the mountain's true voice, not merely the echo of picks on stones, but the deeper music that flowed through mithril veins, like blood through arteries. Each strand of star silver carried its own melody, and together they wove a symphony of such complexity that even the Red King's immortal mind could grasp only fragments of its full meaning. But knowledge came with its price, and that price was paid in changes that could not be hidden from the world above. The excavations that had brought the dwarves so deep into the mountain's heart could not simply be sealed and forgotten too. Many miners had seen too much. Too many craftsmen had felt the pull of the deeper mysteries. Word would spread, as word always did, and with it would come attention that neither dwarf nor demon desired. In the halls of Khazad-dûm, strange rumors began to circulate like smoke through the air shafts. Miners spoke of tools that worked with supernatural efficiency in certain chambers, of mithril that sang back when struck with properly attuned hammers. Master craftsmen reported that their finest works now carried harmonics they had never achieved before, as if some deeper understanding had awakened in their hands. The changes were subtle, at first improvements in technique that could be attributed to natural skill, innovations that seemed to arise from the accumulated wisdom of generations. But as seasons passed and the compact's influence spread through the mountain's halls, even the most skeptical began to notice that their realm was becoming something more than it had been, far above in the world of wind and weather. Other forces felt the tremors of transformation and turned their attention toward the misty mountains with growing concern. The eye of Sauron, ever watchful for shifts in the balance of power, detected changes in the deep places that carried implications he was only beginning to understand. The Dark Lord's servants brought him reports of increased activity around Khazad-dûm's borders. Goblin tribes that had once paid tribute to Mordor now spoke of a Red King who ruled beneath the mountains. Orc bands that had carried the ice tokens were found dead in passages that showed no signs of battle. The network of allegiance that Sauron had spent centuries weaving through the deep places was fraying at its edges, cut strand by forces he could sense but not directly confront. More troubling still were the reports from his spies among the Elven Ring's hints that the seven worn by the dwarf-lords were exhibiting behaviors their makers had never intended. Where once the dwarven rings had merely enhanced their bearers' natural gifts, now they seemed to be awakening to purposes that predated their creation, responding to harmonics that carried echoes of the music itself. In Rivendell and Lothlorien, the wise felt those changes like distant thunder on a clear day. Elrond's ring pulsed with unease whenever his thoughts turned eastward, while Galadriel's mirror showed visions of fires burning in depths where no flame should be able to survive. The carefully maintained balance between the rings of power was shifting, and with it the foundations upon which the Third Age's peace had been built. Yet even as concern grew in the halls of the mighty compact between Durin and the Balrog continued to deepen and strengthen. The Dwarf King found himself privy to secrets that had been hidden since the world's foundation, knowledge of how Mithril had been seeded through the mountain bones during the music's first themes, understanding of the true purpose behind the veins of star silver that webbed through the deep places. The vault's treasures were revealed to him not as mere hoards to be plundered, but as tools crafted for purposes beyond immediate comprehension. Each artifact had been shaped by forces that transcended individual will, designed to serve functions in conflicts that spanned ages and touched upon the very nature of reality itself. And at the vault's heart, where Morgoth's greatest gift lay wrapped in balances of fire and starlight, Durin glimpsed the true stakes of the game that had been playing since the world's youth. The cinder was not merely a source of power, but a key one that could unlock doors between what was and what might be, reshaping the fundamental structures that held reality together. The knowledge was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Durin felt his understanding expand beyond the bounds of mortal comprehension, his perception stretching to encompass vistas that no dwarf-lord had ever imagined. But with that expansion came awareness of the responsibilities that such knowledge carried, the understanding that some powers were too great to be wielded safely by any single will. In the deep places, time moved to rhythms that the surface world could barely comprehend. Seasons passed like heartbeats, while the compact took root and spread its influence through chambers that had known only silence for ages beyond count. Each day brought new revelations, new understanding of forces that had shaped the world from its foundation. But even as dwarf and demon worked together to unlock the mountain's deepest secrets, Other powers were taking notice of their activities. The eye's attention pressed ever more heavily upon the barriers that protected the vault, while in the west, ships were being built that would carry armies whose purpose was not yet clear, but whose destination lay along the shores of Middle-earth. The seasons turned with the inexorable patience of stone, and with each passing year, the Balrog felt the growing weight of attention pressing down upon its mountain realm. In Dol Guldur, where shadows gathered like storm clouds, pregnant with malice, a presence that called itself the Necromancer tested the boundaries of its power with increasing boldness. But the Red King knew that name for what it truly wasn't: other mask worn by the same will that had once demanded submission from all who dwelt in darkness. Sauron had returned to Middle-earth in diminished form, his essence reduced to shadow and spite, but his hunger for dominion remained as sharp as ever. Through networks of corruption that webbed through Mirkwood's heart, the Dark Lord extended his influence like a cancer seeking healthy flesh to devour. Each victory, no matter how small, fed his growing strength and brought him closer to the day when he could reclaim his full power. The Balrog felt those questing tendrils of will like cold fingers testing the bars of a cage, seeking some crack or weakness that might grant entry to the treasures hidden in the mountain's heart. But the barriers that protected the vault had been strengthened beyond recognition since the compact with Durin's house had been sealed. Mithril and fire worked together now in harmonies that transcended their individual natures, creating defenses that could turn aside even the most persistent assault. Yet strength alone was not sufficient to ensure safety in the game that was beginning to unfold across Middle-earth. The Balrog recognized the signs that older powers were stirring from their long sleep eagles, gathering in impossible numbers. Trees walking in the dark hours before dawn, waters running clearer than they had in centuries. The world itself was preparing for conflicts that would dwarf the wars of earlier ages. In the halls of Khazad-dûm, Durin VI walked among his people with the measured pace of one who carries prophecy in his blood. The 7 ring upon his finger had awakened to purposes its makers never intended, burning with fires that seemed to draw their fuel from sources beyond the merely physical. Under its influence, the Dwarf King's perception had expanded beyond mortal limits, allowing him to see the patterns that connected all things in webs of cause and consequence. He could feel the pressure building in the deep places like steam in a sealed vessel each day, bringing new signs that the careful balance maintained for so long was beginning to shift toward something that might be either triumph or catastrophe. The miners who worked the deepest shafts reported strange phenomena, tools that glowed with their own light, stones that rang like bells when struck, passages that seemed to extend further than their dimensions should allow. More troubling were the reports from the border guards who watched the mountain's approaches. Goblin tribes that had raided independently for generations were showing signs of coordination that spoke of guidance from above. Orc bands moved through the high passes with purposes that transcended mere plunder, their leaders bearing tokens of allegiance to powers whose names they whispered only in the deepest darkness. The compact between dwarf and demon had brought benefits beyond counting knowledge that advanced their craft by centuries, understanding that allowed them to work mithril as easily as common iron. But it had also marked them as players in a game whose stakes reached beyond the merely political. They had become guardians of secrets that powers throughout Middle-earth would kill to possess or die to destroy. Nain, heir to Durin's throne and keeper of his father's council, often stood at the great windows that looked out over the mountain's eastern face and watched the shadows gathering in Mirkwood's depths. He could see the darkness spreading through the forest like ink through water, consuming light and hope with equal hunger. Soon, he knew that hunger would turn toward the mountains and the treasures they contained. The choice that faced the Dwarven Kingdom was stark in its simplicity, yet terrible in its implications. They could maintain the compact and accept the protection it offered, knowing that such acceptance would inevitably draw them into conflicts that transcended their understanding. Or they could break the alliance and face whatever came with only their traditional strength of arms and walls, hoping that isolation might preserve them from the storms that were gathering. But isolation, as Durin had come to understand through his communion with the deep fires, was no longer possible. The treasures in the vault were too important to remain hidden forever. The knowledge they represented too dangerous to be left unguarded. The question was not whether they would be drawn into the coming conflicts, but on which side they would stand when battle was finally joined. In the deepest chamber of all, where Morgoth's cinder pulsed with malevolent life, the Balrog felt the first stirrings of the compulsion it had hoped never to experience again. The summons was faint still, barely more than a whisper, carried on currents of malice that connected all dark powers, but it spoke with a voice the demon remembered from ages past. The call came not from Sauron directly, but from the One Ring, hidden away in some secret place where its influence could grow without attracting unwanted attention. The Master Ring was stirring from its long slumber, awakening to purposes that its creator had embedded in the very metal of its making. Soon, very soon, it would begin to sing with the full voice of dominion, and when it did, all who bore rings of power would feel its pull. Even the Mithril barriers that protected the vault would not be sufficient to completely block that summons when it reached full strength. The Balrog could feel the future stretching out before it, like a road that led inexorably toward choices that would reshape the fundamental nature of its existence. The compact with Durin's house was only the beginning. Head lay trials that would test every alliance and challenge every assumption about the nature of power itself. But for now, in the silver-shadowed halls, where dwarf and demon worked together to unlock secrets that predated kingdoms, there was still time for preparation and planning. Each day brought new understanding of forces that moved beneath the surface of events, new appreciation for the complexity of the web that connected all things in bonds of cause and consequence. The deep war was entering its final phase, and when it ended, nothing in Middle-earth would ever be the same again. In the forges of Mount Doom, where the fires of the earth's heart burned with unquenched malice, Sauron labored over the creation that would reshape the balance of all powers. The One Ring took shape under his hands like a prophecy made manifest, its golden surface smooth as a serpent's skin, yet harder than the foundations of the world. Into its making went not merely the craft of his hands, but the essence of his Wiltha-distilled hunger for dominion that had driven him since the music's first corruption. As the Master Ring cooled in the volcanic heat, its influence spread outward like ripples in a dark pool. Every other ring of power felt its awakening, the 9 destined for mortal. Men began to whisper of glories that could be won and kingdoms that could be claimed, while the 7 sang to their dwarf-lord bearers of treasures that lay hidden in places where no light had ever shone. In Khazad-dûm's deepest halls, Durin the Sixth felt the change like a cold wind blowing through chambers that had never known winter's touch. The 7 ring upon his finger grew suddenly heavy, its fire dimming, as if some great shadow had passed between it and the sources of its power. But the dimming was not uniform wear. The ring's radiance touched Mithril. It blazed brighter than ever, the star silver answering with harmonies that spoke of resistance rather than submission. The Balrog felt that resistance and approved, recognizing in it the same fierce independence that had driven its own refusal to bow to powers it had not chosen to serve. The mithril veins that webbed through the mountain's depths were more than mere metal. They were memory made manifest, crystallized recollection of light that had shone before corruption entered the world. Against such purity, even the One Ring's compulsion lost much of its force. Yet the Master Ring's influence could not be entirely denied, and the Balrog felt its pull like a chain around the neck of its will. The summons spoke not in words, but in harmonics, older than speech melodies that awakened memories of brotherhood and shared purpose, reminders of oaths sworn in darkness when the world was young. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the demon wavered between loyalty and independence, torn between the bonds of its past and the freedom it had claimed through centuries of defiance. But in the end, it was the memory of Morgoth himself that settled the question. The Dark Lord had been more than master. He had been the source of purpose that gave meaning to existence itself. To serve another, even one who had once stood at the same throne, would be to diminish that sacred memory and profane the very foundations upon which identity rested. The Balrog's rejection of the One Ring's summons sent shockwaves through the foundations of the world. A refusal so absolute it cracked stone and redirected the flow of underground rivers. In Mount Doom, Sauron felt that denial like a physical blow, his concentration wavering at the moment when precision was most crucial. The One Ring's final cooling was marred by that instant of distraction, creating flaws so subtle they would not be detected for ages, but so fundamental they would ultimately prove fatal. Across Middle-earth, the wise felt the moment when the ring spell reached its completion and shuddered at the implications. In Rivendell, Elrond's ring grew cold as winter stone, while in Lothlorien, Galadriel's mirror showed visions of darkness that stretched from the present into futures, too terrible to contemplate. Only in the Grey Havens did certain Esring maintain its steady radiance, its connection to the sea's eternal rhythms, proof against even the Master Ring's corruption. But it was in the deep places beneath Barazenbar that the ring spell's failure to achieve complete dominion became most apparent. The mithril barriers that protected the vault not only held firm but grew stronger, their star-silver radiance intensified by the very forces that sought to overcome them. What Sauron had intended as the ultimate binding became instead the catalyst for unprecedented resistance. The Balrog used that moment of clarity to weave new protections around its domain, not merely barriers of force and will, but deeper wards that operated according to principles the One Ring could never fully comprehend. The star memory held within Mithril became the foundation for defenses that existed partially outside the normal flow of time, creating spaces where the past's purity could resist the present's corruption. In the halls above, the dwarven smiths found their work transformed by energies they could barely comprehend. Mithril that had been difficult to work now flowed like water under their hammers, taking shapes that seemed to exist in harmony with forces beyond the merely physical. Their greatest masterworks began to sing with voices that carried echoes of the music itself, creating artifacts whose beauty and power exceeded anything achieved in earlier ages. Yet with that transformation came awareness of dangers that threatened not merely kingdoms, but the fundamental nature of reality itself. Durin the Sixth walked through his expanded realm with eyes that could see the patterns connecting all things, and what he saw filled him with both wonder and terror. The compact with the Balrog had made his people guardians of more than treasures. They had become custodians of the very forces that held the world together. In distant Mordor, Sauron raged at the incompleteness of his triumph, the failure to achieve the total dominion he had envisioned when the One Ring first took shape in his mind. The majority of the rings answered his call as intended. The Nine sang with harmonies of submission that would eventually transform their bearers into shadows of their former selves, while most of the Seven carried enough of his influence to corrupt their dwarf-lord owners through avarice and pride. But the greatest prizes remained beyond his reach. The 3 rings of the elves had been hidden away by their bearers, their location concealed by arts that even his enhanced perception could not penetrate. And in the deep places beneath the misty mountains, powers that predated his corruption continued to defy his will with a stubbornness that made mockery of his pretensions to ultimate authority. The stage was set for conflicts that would determine not merely who ruled Middle-earth, but what fundamental principles would govern reality itself. In the silver-shadowed halls where dwarf and demon worked together to understand forces beyond mortal comprehension, ancient prophecies were beginning to stir toward fulfillment. And in the deepest vault of all, where Morgoth's cinder pulsed with patient malice, the first signs appeared of changes that would ultimately require choices no power in Middle-earth was prepared to make. The years flowed like molten metal through the channels of history, each season bringing new signs that the careful balance of power was shifting toward something unprecedented in Middle-earth's long memory. The One Ring's influence spread through the world like a plague of dominion, binding wills and corrupting purposes with a subtlety that made its victories seem natural and inevitable. In the halls of mortal kings, the 9 rings whispered of glories that could be won through strength and cunning, feeding ambitions that grew like cancer in their bearers' hearts. One by one, the greatest rulers of men found their thoughts turning toward conquest and domination, their natural desires for peace and prosperity overwhelmed by hungers that could never be satisfied. The transformation was gradual but inexorable, heroes becoming tyrants, protectors becoming predators, until the very concept of righteous authority became a memory preserved only in songs too ancient for modern ears to fully comprehend. Among the dwarf-lords, the corruption took a different form, but was no less devastating in its ultimate effects. The 7 rings kindled their bearers' natural love of craftsmanship into obsessions that consumed all other considerations. Gold and silver, gems and precious metals became more important than kinship or honor, driving the children of Ola to seek treasures in places where wisdom would have counseled restraint. Yet, in the halls of Khazad-dûm, where Mithril sang with the voice of uncorrupted starlight, the 7 rings' influence found itself strangely muted. Durin Vi felt its pull as keenly as any of his kindred, but the star-silver barriers that surrounded him created zones of clarity where foreign compulsions lost much of their force. The ring still whispered of treasures hidden in the deep places, but its voice carried harmonics of partnership rather than dominations, suggestions rather than commands. The Balrog watched the ring spell's partial failure with satisfaction tempered by growing concern. The resistance of the Mithril barriers was holding firm against Sauron's immediate influence. But the demon could sense deeper currents stirring in response to the One Ring's awakening. Forces that had slumbered since the world's youth were beginning to stir, drawn to consciousness by the unprecedented concentration of power that Sauron had achieved. The answers came not in words, but in the deeper language of experience, written in fire and starlight upon the substance of their souls. They were becoming something unprecedented in Middle-earth's history, beings that existed at the intersection of mortal and immortal, time-bound, yet touched by forces that transcended temporal limitation. In the world above, where kings rose and fell like waves upon a shore, the effects of their transformation began to manifest in ways that troubled friend and foe alike. Khazad-dûm's borders became increasingly difficult to penetrate, not through military might, but through subtle alterations in the very nature of space and time that surrounded the mountain realm. Travelers reported passages that led in circles despite following straight paths, distances that varied according to the intentions of those who measured them. The mountain itself seemed to be awakening to consciousness, responding to threats, not with avalanche or earthquake, but with corrections to reality that left intruders confused and disoriented. Yet these changes, remarkable as they were, served only as preparation for the greater transformation that was approaching. In the deepest vault, where Morgoth's cinder waited with the patience of geological ages, ancient mechanisms that had slumbered since the world's foundation were beginning to stir toward wakefulness. The final phase of the Deep War was about to begin, and when it ended, nothing in Middle-earth, perhaps nothing in existence itself, would ever be the same. The summons came like fire, racing through veins of molten stone, carrying with it the weight of authority that had once commanded the loyalty of beings whose power could reshape countenance. Deep in the vault, where starlight met under fire in perfect balance, the Balrog felt that call pierce through barriers of myth and will like a sword thrust to the heart of identity itself. Sauron's voice spoke not in words, but in the deeper language of dominion, the primal tongue that had been used to bind the Aenir to their various purposes when the world was young. The summons carried echoes of shared corruption, memories of brotherhood in darkness, reminders of oaths sworn in the depths of Utumno when Melkor's vision seemed to offer salvation from the tyranny of divine order. But beneath those harmonies of persuasion lay threads of compulsion that made the demon's essence writhe with fury. This was not a call between equals, but a master's demand upon a servant, an assumption of authority that transformed ancient brotherhood into chains of obligation. The One Ring's influence poured through the summons like poison through water, seeking to bind what had chosen to remain free. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the Balrog wavered on the knife edge between submission and defiance. The pull of the summons was almost overwhelming. It spoke to aspects of its nature that had been shaped by millennia of service, awakening responses that ran deeper than conscious thought. To answer that call would be to reclaim its place in the hierarchy of power, to stand once more among beings whose might could challenge the very foundations of reality. But even as temptation tugged at the corners of its will, another voice spoke from the depths of Medbrinot, unbending purpose that had driven its choices since the day Morgoth was cast beyond the circles of the world. The unquenched oath still bound its loyalty to the one master it had chosen to serve, and that master's will remained unchanged despite his absence. more than mere fidelity, drove the demon's ultimate decision. In the centuries since, it had descended into the mountain's heart. Contact with Mithril's star-touched purity had awakened memories that predated corruption, recollections of the time when it had served in Allah's halls as a being of creative fire rather than destructive hunger. Those memories carried their own music, harmonies of making and shaping that stood in stark opposition to Sauron's song of dominion and control. The Balrog's rejection came not as words, but as a symphony of refusal that shook the mountain's foundations and sent shockwaves racing through the fire roads that networked the deep places. Every note carried the weight of choice freely made. Every harmony proclaimed independence that no power, no matter how great, could claim without consent. The force of that rejection shattered Sauron's summons like crystal under a hammer's blow, sending fragments of compulsion racing back toward their source, with interest multiplied tenfold. In Barad-dûr, the Dark Lord reeled under the impact of his own authority, turned back upon itself, his concentration shattered at the moment when precision was most crucial. But the Balrog's defiance carried costs that extended far beyond the immediate satisfaction of resistance. The rejection had been powered by forces drawn from the deepest levels of its being, energies that could not be replaced easily or quickly. More troubling still, the summons had revealed the true extent of Sauron's growing power strength that would soon be sufficient to challenge even the mightiest barriers if applied with sufficient focus and patience. In the silver-shadowed halls, where dwarf and demon had worked together to unlock the mountain's secrets, alarms began to sound that had no need of bells or horns to make themselves known. The mithril veins that webbed through the vault's defenses blazed with sudden radiance as ancient wards activated in response to threats that transcended the merely physical. Durin the Sixth felt the change like lightning racing through his bones, the seven ring upon his finger blazing with fire that seemed to draw its fuel from sources beyond the material world. The compact that bound his people to the Red King had evolved beyond simple alliance into something that existed at the intersection of identity and purpose, making them partners in a transformation that neither side fully understood. Through eyes that blazed with more than mortal sight, the Dwarf King perceived the true nature of the choice that faced them all. The rejection of Sauron's summons had been only the beginning. Head lay trials that would test every assumption about the nature of power and the price of freedom. They could no longer remain neutral observers in conflicts that shaped the world's hidden architecture. They had become active participants in struggles whose outcome would determine the fundamental principles by which reality itself operated. Yet even as danger pressed close from all sides, the Balrog found itself changed by the very act of resistance. The memories awakened by contact with starlight had grown stronger and more coherent, revealing aspects of its original nature that had survived corruption intact. It was no longer merely a fallen Maya seeking to preserve its independence. It was a being in the process of becoming something entirely new, shaped by choices that transcended the limitations of its past. In the deepest chamber, where Morgoth's cinder pulsed with patient malice, those changes began to manifest in ways that would have shocked even the Dark Lord himself. The fragment of pure corruption that lay at the vault's heart found itself surrounded by forces that operated according to principles it could not corrupt or control. Energies drawn from the time before its master's rebellion, when creation itself had been unblemished by the discord that poisoned the music's themes. The stage was set for the final movement in a symphony that had been playing since the world's foundation. And when that movement reached its crescendo, the very nature of good and evil would be redefined in ways that neither light nor shadow had anticipated. Through passages carved by waters older than memory, where the bones of the earth lay naked beneath veils of perpetual darkness, the footfalls of the fellowship echoed like heartbeats in the mountain's ancient chest. They had come seeking passage through realms where no light of star or sun had ever shone, carrying with them burdens that would reshape the fate of all men. The Balrog felt their approach through senses that transcended mere physical perception, tasting their purpose on currents of air that carried more than breath, hope, and despair intermingled, courage seasoned with the bitter salt of necessary sacrifice. At their heart burned a presence that made even the demon's ancient fires seem pale by comparison. Not the crude power of domination, but something far more dangerous and precious. Gandalf the Grey walked among them with staff in hand and wisdom in his eyes, but the Balrog's attention was drawn to another member of their company, one whose burden sang with harmonies that resonated through every chamber of the vault. The One Ring, long hidden in shadow and secrecy, had emerged into the light at last, and its song carried implications that made the mountain itself tremble in response. For centuries, the demon had felt that distant music as a whisper at the edge of consciousness, a thread of compulsion that tugged always at the corners of its will. Now, carried by one whose courage burned brighter than mithril fire, the Master Ring's influence blazed with unprecedented clarity, and in that clarity, the Balrog perceived at last the true nature of Sauron's ultimate defeat. The Ring-bearer's purpose was not mere destruction, but transformation, the turning of Sauron's greatest weapon against itself through acts of sacrifice that transcended the logic of power. In Frodo's determination to see his burden destroyed rather than wielded, the demon recognized an echo of its own choice to serve principle rather than profit, independence rather than dominion. Yet recognition brought with it the awareness of terrible necessity. The Fellowship's path would carry them through chambers where the deep war's final resolution awaited, places where choices made in ages past would finally bear their fruit. The Balrog could no more allow them to pass unopposed than fire could permit itself to be quenched by rain, not from malice, but from the inexorable logic of its nature and purpose. The encounter, when it came, erupted with all the fury of geological forces finally released from their constraints. Upon the bridge of Khazad-dûm, where dwarfcraft had spanned an abyss that plunged toward the world's molten heart, two powers met in combat that transcended the merely physical. Fire clashed with light, shadow with illumination, in patterns that rewrote the fundamental equations by which reality operated. But this was no simple battle between good and evil, no crude contest of strength against strength. The Balrog fought with the desperate fury of one who understood that defeat might mean more than mere destruction. It could mean the unmaking of everything. It had worked to preserve and protect the vault with its treasures, the compact with Durin's house. The very principle of independence itself, hung in the balance, as ancient enemies grappled above depths that had no bottom. Gandalf met that fury with wisdom that had been tempered in the fires of ages, his power drawn not from dominion but from service, freely given to purposes greater than individual will. Yet even his strength had limits, and as the battle raged through chambers that had known only peace since the world's making, Both combatants felt the approach of conclusions that neither had anticipated. The pursuit through Durin Tower carried them beyond the boundaries of the merely physical into realms where thought became substance, and will reshape reality through acts of pure intention, up through passages that existed as much in possibility as actuality, past windows that looked out upon vistas that might have been memory or prophecy. They climbed toward a confrontation that would resolve tensions older than the sun. Upon the peak of Xeroxeagle, where the mountain's crown pierced the sky like a spear aimed at heaven's heart, the final movement of their duel began. Here, where snow fell upward and the very air burned with energies that predated corruption, the Red King reared to its full majesty wings, spread wide enough to eclipse stars, crown of fire blazing with the concentrated hatred of ages. But even as it prepared to deliver the blow that would end Gandalf's interference forever, the Balrog felt something shift in the deepest foundations of its being. The memories awakened by contact with Mithril had been growing stronger throughout their battle, and now they blazed with clarity that cut through corruption like starlight through shadow. In that moment of perfect vision, the demon saw at last the true nature of its choice, not between victory and defeat, but between the darkness it had embraced and the light it had once served. The grapple with Gandalf had become something more than combat. It had become the crucible in which transformation could finally be completed. When they fell together into the abyss that yawned beneath the bridge's span, their descent carried more than physical weight. The shock of their impact sent tremors racing through the mountain's roots, fracturing connections that had held firm for ages beyond count. In the vault far below, delicate balances that had preserved Morgoth's cinder for millennia shifted beyond all recovery. The cinder vault quenched to silence as Starsilver and Underfire found new equilibrium, their opposing forces neutralizing the malice that had pulsed at the mountain's heart since the world's foundation. Sauron's reach into the deep places withered like a severed limb, his carefully maintained network of influence collapsing as its anchors dissolved into harmless ash. Upon the peak where snow fell like tears of joy, Gandalf, the white rose with power that blazed brighter than the sun itself, not merely returned from death, but transformed by passage through trials that had tested the very foundations of his being. The victory was complete, but its cost had been measured in the willing sacrifice of one who had chosen light over darkness when choice still remained possible. In the deep places where silence now reigned, where fire had burned since the world's making, new songs began to echo through chambers that had known only discord for ages beyond count. The mountain's voice had changed, its harmonies purified by passage through crucibles of choice and sacrifice that transformed corruption into something approaching grace. The hidden war was ended at last, not through conquest, but through the alchemy of willing transformation. And in that ending, Middle-earth itself was changed in ways that would echo through all the ages yet to come, until the final music brought all discord to its ultimate resolution in harmonies too beautiful for any single voice to contain. And so we come to the end of our tale, dear listeners, as all tales must end when their purpose has been fulfilled and their truths revealed. In the silver silence that now fills chambers where ancient fires once burned with unquenchable rage, we find not emptiness, but completion, the resolution of conflicts that had torn at the world's heart since the music's first discordant note. The deep war between eye and ember was never truly about dominion or treasure. though both powers believed otherwise for ages beyond count. It was about the fundamental question that lies at the heart of all existence: whether beings of power must inevitably become slaves to their nature, or whether choice remains possible even in the darkest depths of corruption. The Balrog's final transformation upon Xerxegal's peak revealed the answer that had been hidden in starlight all along. Even the most fallen could choose redemption when confronted with truths too pure to be denied. Even the most corrupted could remember the light they had once served when darkness lost its power to blind them utterly. In chambers beneath Barazanbar, where Mithril sings its eternal songs of memory and hope, the mountain keeps watch over secrets that no longer require guarding. The vault stands empty now, its treasures transformed into something far more precious than gold or gemsa: the knowledge that freedom exists wherever beings have the courage to claim it. The dwarves of Durin's line returned to their halls in later days, following paths that led through chambers purified by sacrifice and choice. They found their realm changed beyond recognition, yet somehow more itself than ever before, kingdom where craft and creation flourished in harmony with forces that had once threatened to consume all light. And in the world above, where the final movements of the War of the Ring played out their destined patterns, the hidden victory beneath the mountain ensured that darkness could never again claim dominion over the deep places. The fire roads carried songs of starlight rather than shadow, while the nameless things that dwelt in the deepest caverns learned to serve purposes that built rather than destroyed. Let this tale be a comfort to you as sleep draws near, a reminder that even in the darkest depths, choice remains possible for those with courage to embrace it. The ember that defied the eye burns, still in the spaces between heartbeats, in the silence between breaths, in the gentle darkness that welcomes weary souls to rest. Close your eyes now, and let the deep peace that comes after great labors settle upon you like starlight on still water. In dreams, perhaps, you may walk the silver halls where ancient enmities have been transformed into harmonies of understanding, where the music plays on in movements too beautiful for waking ears to fully comprehend. Sleep well, wanderers of the twilight paths. The deep places are at peace at last, and in that peace, all who seek rest may find the welcome they have earned through their journey into the heart of hidden truths.